Welcome back to Q Station. Today we're going to be looking at what daily life was like for the 13,000 people that came through the quarantine station in its 156 years of history. We're going to discover that your experience here depended largely upon the circumstances under which you've arrived. Okay, so depending on what class you were, what race you were, what gender you were, very much determined what kind of experience you had here in quarantine. The very act of quarantine is about segregation, right? It's what we're seeing today during COVID-19. We're seeing people segregating themselves by self-isolating at home. We're seeing segregation in the hospitals of patients with COVID-19, and we're seeing segregation in hotel quarantine. So that's our very basic level of the idea of quarantine. The boats that were arriving here in Sydney were instantly segregated as they came through the heads by the simple act of turning right when they came into the harbour through those heads. They came into quarantine and they were therefore segregated from the rest of the Sydney community. Once they arrived here at the station, there was further segregation. We see the landscape reflect this segregation. We see our first class area, second class, third class area, and we're going to be exploring this as we move around the site. We're very lucky that it was a quarantine station right up until 1984, so the site is largely reflective of the attitudes of the time. So prior to the 1850s, the accommodation here at the quarantine station was very basic and was barracks style accommodation for all classes of passengers. By the 1870s, we start to see people arriving by steamship, and people are purchasing first, second or third class tickets. So they're arriving here at the quarantine station and they're starting to demand that the accommodation here at the quarantine station reflect what they had on board their ship. So if they paid for a first class ticket, they expected the accommodation to reflect that standard of travel. By the 1870s, people started arriving here by steamship, and these steamships had their first, second and third class accommodation. Passengers were arriving here and they weren't happy with the barrack style accommodation that was offered, and they started to demand that the accommodation here at the quarantine station reflect the accommodation they'd had on board their ship. So if they'd paid for a first class ticket, they expected the same standard of accommodation here at the quarantine station. So the government went into a big building program to build the accommodation to reflect that, and we start to see these buildings appear up here in first class. So this building program was completed to meet the passengers' demands for the proper classification of passengers. So the building program changed the layout of the quarantine station. We see our first class accommodation set up here, high on the healthy ground. Second class appears, and then our old barrack style accommodation for the original immigrants' quarters become the third class accommodation. So by 1918, when Spanish flu hit Australia, the quarantine station was largely as you can see it today. It was able to house 1,208 people. During Spanish influenza, we had almost double that amount here. We had 2,500 people housed here at the quarantine station. So we had an overflow of people. We had more than half of those people actually sleeping in tents pitched all over the site. And we can actually see evidence of one of the tent poles in its original position underneath one of the buildings over here today. So the experience of the healthy passengers here at the quarantine station was often described as one of an extended holiday. Of course, if you were sick, that was another story. Here up in first class passengers were given access to a full-size tennis court. They played games on the main street, cricket, potato sack races for the kids. There was quoits, there was swimming, there were concerts, there were dances. So there was lots and lots of fun to be had up here at first class. Here in the first class dining room, this is where they would have met every night to dine. So dining was a really big occasion. They'd all get dressed up and come here for dinner each night. So they would eat off Wedgwood plates, and some of those were inscribed with little inscriptions, things like "Eat thy food with a thoughtful heart." Okay, little reminders of how to be appreciative of what you have. So having a look at the first class dining room, if you have a look around, you can see it's very small. Okay, so first class was the smallest class of people travelling here to the quarantine station, but they did have the nicest experience. They had the best of the best provided to them here at the quarantine station. So they were cooked for by the cooks on board the ship. The stewards were provided to tend to their every need, and this was all paid for them by the shipping company that had brought them here. So the shipping company bore the cost of the quarantine. So the experiences we see up here, we've got lots of lovely photos in our archives of people actually having a lovely time here under the yellow flag of quarantine. Lots of happy faces and lots of positivity coming out of the first class experience of quarantine. So this is the third class precinct up here behind me. The biggest building you can see behind me is the third class dining room. So as you can see, it is much larger than the first class dining room. Third class was the way most people could afford to travel, so that was the way most people arrived here at the quarantine station. This room was actually repurposed during the Spanish influenza outbreak of 1918 to 1919, and it was used as an acute ward for victims of Spanish influenza, whereas the hospital was kept just for those critical cases. So this was the scene that greeted the 1,040 troops aboard a troop ship called the Argyleshire that arrived here in February of 1919 with Spanish influenza on board. They'd already suffered every kind of delay on their journey home from the battlefronts. They were Anzac men, they were men suffering from shell shock, they were men who had been invalid from war wounds. So a lot of suffering already on board this ship, looking forward to a triumphant return home, only to be delayed at Albany, where they had to load coal during a wharf labourers strike there. So then they came through Melbourne, where they were delayed once more in quarantine, picked up a few more passengers, came into Sydney Harbour and again was sent in for a quarantine period. One of the passengers they'd picked up down in Melbourne was showing signs of Spanish influenza. They were kept on their ship, just moored out here off Chowder Bay for 4 days. So during that time, the authorities were arguing over exactly whose responsibility they were. Were they the responsibility of the army or were they the responsibility of quarantine? So this battle was going on behind the scenes. The troops were getting more and more restless, and a few of them decided that it was time to pull up anchor. So they tried to pull up anchor, get the ship under steam so it could make its way into the closest Sydney harbour. When that failed, 42 men actually commandeered 3 lifeboats and they made their escape that way. So all of those lifeboats were rounded up by police, but not until 2 of the men aboard had made their way as far as Maitland and Newcastle. So all of this has happened and they haven't even yet arrived here at the quarantine station. Eventually the authorities have decided that yes, they are the responsibility of quarantine and that there will be room made available here for them. So they were landed here at the quarantine station. And their nightmare continued. They were made to walk uphill carrying their kits, carrying tents. They had to walk uphill for a mile. This is a very hilly site and it's a hard site to navigate at the best of times. So they were forced to do that. Then they had to dig trenches, pitch their own tents and settle in to their quarantine period. On top of that, they had the problem of the brown snakes here at the quarantine station. So one soldier reports that they actually killed 60 brown snakes in their very first night here at the quarantine station. One soldier was reported to spend the night up his tent pole with shell shock, mumbling to himself, and did not come down for the whole night. So troops were escaping down to the wharf to get away from the brown snakes, and the next morning 900 of these troops decided that enough was enough. They're going to leave the quarantine station. So they formed up in perfect marching order, broke through demarcation barriers and marched up to the Manly Gate. News of this intended escape made its way through to Major General Lee, who promised he would meet them at Sydney Harbour in Circular Quay to listen to their complaints, and he promised them a ferry from Manly Wharf to get them to Circular Quay. So these men marched under the guidance of their NCOs, marched down into Manly. And it was interesting to note at this time masks were mandatory here in Sydney during Spanish influenza. So these men marched out of the station quite orderly, wearing their masks. It was quite a peaceful escape here from the quarantine station, actually the only successful escape we had here from the quarantine station. So they were met with their ferry down at the wharf, jumped on the ferry, got into Sydney, where Major General Lee greeted them and listened to their complaints. They demanded that they be sent to Victoria Barracks. This was denied by Major General Lee, who said that the tone of the barracks would not be undermined by such unsoldierly behaviour, and they were ordered to march to the Sydney Cricket Ground, which is where they saw out their quarantine. So everything that's happening today has its parallel in history. As we've seen from recent events, even a pandemic can't stop people from standing up for what they believe in. The same thing was true for Spanish influenza. We've seen it with the Annie Egan story, where there was a massive outcry nationwide about the treatment of Annie Egan, and we've now seen it with the behaviour of the Argyllshire troops. They were determined to get the welcome back that they thought they were entitled to after spending so many years fighting for their country. So as we're discovering, this site's all about segregation, okay, and that's reflected in the landscape today. We're seeing layers and layers of segregation. So we've explored the first and the third class accommodation. Here we have another class of accommodation, and this is our Asiatics accommodation. So by the 1850s, the largest non-British immigrant group was the Chinese, okay, so we started to see them arriving here because of the gold rush. Up until then, the arrangements for any of the Chinese people arriving here at the quarantine station had been very ad hoc and very inferior. So there was really a lot of indifference afforded to the Chinese people as they arrived here. By the 1900s, we're starting to realise we actually need to house them at the very least. So this aligned with the federal government taking over the running of the quarantine station and that government's first act of parliament, which was the Immigration Restriction Act, commonly known as the White Australia Policy. So we see our Asiatics accommodation start to be used here in 1904. So each of these 3 rooms was designed to house 60 men in 3-tiered bunks. They didn't separate the sick from the healthy, so they were left to care for their own ill. They were given an outdoor kitchen to cook in and very scant supplies. They had to cook for themselves. Every other class had chefs that were employed to cook for them. The block does have toilets and showers on either end of it, but very often they were not given any running water here in Asiatics because it was feared that they would waste the water that was required for the rest of the station. The White Australia Policy and the inferior treatment of the Chinese people here at the quarantine station reflected the racial attitudes in Australia at the time and, of course, around the world. The White Australia Policy was put into place to keep the Chinese out of Australia purely because of the fear of disease. It was thought that they would be the carriers of disease. We see Edmund Barton, Australia's first Prime Minister, state that the doctrine of equality of man was never designed for the Englishman and the Chinaman. So as you can see, the station and the landscape in which it sits is a really intact reflection of Australia's social and political history from the 1830s right through until 1984, when the station finally closed its doors for good. I just wanted to finish with a story that shows you just how different quarantines could be here at the quarantine station. So here we have the inscription from the Irangi, which was a New Zealand ship that arrived here a number of times throughout its life, but particularly we see here in 1930 and 1935. In 1930, that experience was one of despair, really. They arrived under the cover of darkness. They were landed under the cover of darkness, which created a whole lot of confusion and chaos across the site and much stress amongst the passengers, so much so that it was actually described as a terrible place. In 1935, we see the same ship arrive here, and this time the experience is one of happiness and joy. People describe it as being an extended holiday, having a wonderful time here, and it was actually described as one continuous picnic. So 2 completely different experiences, purely coming down to what the journey had been like beforehand, the culture on the boat, the atmosphere amongst the passengers. So this ship's quarantine in 1935 was summed up by a passenger called Mrs. Isabel Briley, and she wrote this following poem. Oh, to be in quarantine now that summer's here, phoning to your friends at work, sending out for beer. Bathe by day and bridge by night, life of endless play. Oh, to be in quarantine, banking up your pay.